Chapter 1. A locked room. Enigma. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of damp earth and dying leaves as the guests at the Château de Verneuil gathered in the grand drawing-room. The mansion, an elegant estate nestled deep in the French countryside, belonged to Madame Élise Laurent, a wealthy widow known for her extravagant soirees. But tonight's gathering was not one of celebration. A crime had been committed. The body of Armand Morel, an esteemed art dealer, had been discovered in Madame Laurent's private study, a room kept under strict lock and key. He had been found seated at the grand mahogany desk, a single bullet wound to his temple. A revolver lay at his feet. At first glance, it appeared to be suicide, but Commissaire Lucien Giraud, the local investigator, had quickly dismissed the idea. There was no suicide note, and Morel, by all accounts, had neither debts nor enemies. More perplexing still was the study itself, a veritable locked-room puzzle. The heavy doors had been locked from the inside, the only window bolted shut. No sign of forced entry. And yet the killer had come and gone without a trace, or almost without a trace. A single fingerprint had been found on the revolver. Just one, and it belonged to Madame Laurent herself. Madame Laurent, a regal woman in her 60s with silver hair coiled in a chignon, sat rigidly in a velvet armchair, her face an unreadable mask. Around her, the guests whispered in hushed voices, darting uneasy glances at one another. The question hung thick in the air. Had the gracious hostess committed murder in her own home? It was at this moment that Hercule Poirot made his entrance. Dressed immaculately in a deep blue suit, his patent leather shoes gleaming, he stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back. His egg-shaped head tilted slightly, his green eyes sharp with calculation. With deliberate care, he removed his gloves, revealing fastidiously manicured hands. "Messieurs, mesdames," he said, his voice smooth yet commanding, "I have been informed of a most intriguing crime." He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on each face for a fraction of a second longer than was comfortable. "Let us see what the little grey cells can uncover, n'est-ce pas?" The room fell into an uneasy silence as Hercule Poirot stepped forward, ready to unravel the mystery of the missing fingerprint. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The assembled guests watched Poirot with a mixture of relief and trepidation as he took a measured step into the drawing-room of Château de Verneuil. Though they had no doubt of his brilliance, his reputation had preceded him. There was something unnerving about his presence. With slow deliberation, Poirot straightened his cuffs and allowed his gaze to settle on Commissaire Lucien Giraud, the man in charge of the case. Giraud, a tall, broad-shouldered Frenchman with a neatly trimmed moustache, met Poirot's look with a frown of mild irritation. He had worked with Poirot before, and though he respected the man's intellect, found his methods insufferably methodical. "Well, Poirot," Giraud said gruffly, "you've arrived just in time. This case is as bizarre as they come. The victim, Armand Morel, was found dead in Madame Laurent's locked study. The door was sealed from within, and the window was bolted shut. Yet somehow a murderer entered, killed him, and vanished." Poirot nodded, his eyes glinting with interest. "And the fingerprint on the revolver?" Giraud crossed his arms. "Singularly odd. Only one print was found, on the grip of the gun. It belongs to Madame Laurent." Poirot turned toward the widow, who sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Despite her calm exterior, Poirot's keen eyes noticed the tension in her posture, the way her fingers dug into the silk of her dress. "Madame Laurent," he said gently, "forgive me if I appear intrusive, but I must ask, how do you explain your fingerprint upon the weapon?" The room held its breath. "I cannot," she replied simply, her voice even but strained. "I have never touched a gun in my life." Poirot pursed his lips, tilting his head slightly. "And yet, the evidence suggests otherwise. You are saying, then, that the fingerprint was placed there deliberately?" Giraud scoffed. "You're suggesting someone lifted her print and planted it on the weapon? That's a rather elaborate trick, Poirot." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. "But, mon ami, when a thing is too obvious, is it not sometimes because it is meant to be seen?" Giraud exhaled sharply, clearly impatient, but Poirot had already turned his attention to the rest of the room. "Messieurs et mesdames, before I proceed, allow me to make my introductions properly." He clasped his hands together. "I am Hercule Poirot, and I have been asked to assist in the investigation of Monsieur Morel's tragic demise. I must ask for your patience, for I am most particular in my methods. Each of you, I presume, had some acquaintance with the deceased." There was a murmur of "Excellent," Poirot said, smiling. "Then let us become better acquainted." The suspects one by one, Poirot's gaze swept across the gathered individuals, his mind already sorting them into careful categories. Madame Elise Laurent, Cersei Ebe, hostess, the wealthy widow and owner of the chateau. She was elegant, dignified, and well regarded, yet now under the most suspicion. Her single fingerprint on the murder weapon was damning, but too convenient. Victor Dufresne, the nephew, Madame, Laurent's nephew and heir, a man of 35 with sharp cheekbones and an impatient air. He stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his gaze darting nervously between Poirot and Giraud. Did he fear discovery, or was it merely the discomfort of being under scrutiny? Celeste Bernard, the housekeeper. A matronly woman in her 50s, with a deeply lined face and calloused hands from years of service. Her voice was gruff, but her eyes were wary. She had been one of the last to see Morel alive before he retreated to the study. Jacques Lemaitre, the business partner, a portly man with a neatly waxed moustache, Morel's business associate in the world of art dealing. His reputation was one of ruthless efficiency. Morel's death meant a complete restructuring of their enterprise and quite possibly an immense financial gain. Beatrice Morel, the victim's wife, a striking woman in her late 30s, dressed in mourning black. Her pale face was composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a lace handkerchief. She had been staying at the chateau with her husband, though some whispered of trouble in their marriage. Henri Gautier, the house guest. A well-known art critic who had been visiting the chateau that weekend. His sharp, observant eyes missed little, and yet he had claimed to hear nothing unusual on the night of the murder. Too convenient. Poirot took a step forward. "Now," he said pleasantly, "perhaps each of you could recount where you were at the time of the murder." The alibi's Madame Laurent claimed to have been reading in her bedroom, having retired early. No one could confirm this. Victor Dufresne had been in the billiards room, playing alone. Again, no witnesses. Celeste Bernard had been preparing the evening, tea in the kitchen. The cook confirmed this, but she had left the kitchen briefly. Jacques Lemaitre had been in his guest quarters, writing letters. Beatrice Morel had been in the library, supposedly too engrossed in a book to have noticed anything. Henri Gautier had been on the terrace, smoking a cigar, alone. Poirot's fingers drummed lightly against his lapel. "It is curious," he mused. "Every one of you claims to have been alone, and yet a man has been murdered in a locked room." A silence fell upon the room. Then Giraud cleared his throat. "The simplest explanation is the correct one. The room was locked from the inside. Morel shot himself. Case closed." Poirot arched an eyebrow. "A man commits suicide, yet leaves only one fingerprint on the gun. No others? How curious." Giraud hesitated. Perhaps he was wearing gloves and only removed one momentarily. Wow, shook his head. "No, my friend, consider this. If Morel had truly shot himself, his fingerprints should have been all over the gun, the barrel, the trigger, the cylinder. And yet there is but one fingerprint belonging to Madame Laurent." His gaze flickered toward Madame Laurent, who met his stare evenly, but said nothing. Poirot sighed. "No, no, no. Suicide is impossible. And thus we must ask ourselves, why is there only one print? Why is it Madame Laurent's? And more importantly, where are the others?" This question sent a ripple of unease through the room. Someone had wiped the gun clean, but deliberately left a single incriminating mark, and that, to Poirot, was more intriguing than anything else. He clasped his hands together, his smile enigmatic. "Let us proceed, mes amis. The game of the mind has begun." Chapter 3. The First False Lead. The room remained eerily silent after Poirot's declaration. The weight of his words had settled like a thick fog, leaving each suspect to ponder the implications. Someone had deliberately wiped the gun, leaving only one fingerprint behind. The question was, who and why? Commissaire Giraud, always the skeptic, let out an exasperated sigh and folded his arms. "Poirot, you love your little riddles, but this is all unnecessary. Madame Laurent's fingerprint is on the weapon, and no one else's. The logical conclusion is that she fired the shot." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his moustache twitching slightly in amusement. "Logical? Non, mon ami. Convenient, perhaps, but logic. Ah, that is another matter." He turned to Madame Laurent, who sat stiff-backed in her chair. "Madame, if I may, when was the last time you handled a firearm?" Madame Laurent's gaze remained steady. "Never, Monsieur Poirot." "Curious, indeed," Poirot murmured. "And yet your fingerprint has found its way onto a revolver. A most extraordinary feat, is it not?" Giraud rolled his eyes. "You and your psychology." Poirot ignored him, instead revisiting the suspect's statements in his mind. Celeste Bernard, the housekeeper, claimed she had been in the servants' quarters at the time of the murder. Beatrice Morel had been in her bedroom, alone, mourning. Victor Dufresne was out walking the grounds, alone. Jacques Lemaitre was at a business meeting in Paris, or so he claimed. Each alibi was convenient, too convenient. But then a realization struck Poirot, a small yet damning discrepancy between the testimonies. He turned abruptly to Giraud. "Mon cher, tell me, when the murder occurred, who was the first to arrive at the study?" Giraud frowned. "Celeste Bernard, the housekeeper. She said she ran there when she heard the gunshot." Poirot leaned forward sharply, his moustache twitching. "And yet she claimed that when she arrived, Beatrice Morel was already outside the door." Giraud blinked. "So?" Poirot's voice was soft, yet firm. "If Beatrice Morel was truly alone in her bedroom, how did she reach the study so quickly?" A heavy silence filled the room. Giraud straightened. "You think Beatrice Morel got there first because she was already nearby?" Poirot gave a knowing smile. "It would suggest she was not in her bedroom, as she claims." An unexpected visitor before Giraud could respond. A knock sounded at the parlour door. The butler, Henri, entered hesitantly. "Monsieur Poirot, a visitor has arrived. He says it is urgent." Poirot arched an eyebrow. "A visitor? At such an hour?" Henri stepped aside to reveal a tall, gaunt man in a grey overcoat. His eyes were sunken, his expression anxious. "Messieurs," he said in a hoarse voice, "my name is Antoine Marchand. I must speak with you regarding the murder of François Morel." Poirot rose smoothly. "Bien sûr, Monsieur Marchand. What brings you here?" Marchand glanced at Giraud before shifting uncomfortably. "I was a former associate of Morel's. I handled his private financial matters." Giraud scoffed. "Another business partner? Are we expected to believe you had nothing to gain from his death?" Marchand held up a trembling hand. "No, you don't. Understand, I came because I believe Morel knew he was going to die." Poirot's eyes narrowed sharply. "Explain." Marchand exhaled shakily. 3 days before his death, Morel came to me and demanded that I withdraw all his liquid assets, every centime. Poirot tilted his head. "And did he say why?" Marchand hesitated. "No, but he was afraid. Morel was a hard man, but I could see it. He was terrified." Poirot exchanged a glance with Giraud. "And did he collect the money?" Marchand swallowed. "No. The next day he was dead." Poirot tapped his chin. "Then the question becomes, who knew he intended to withdraw that money?" Marchand hesitated. "Only a few people. Myself, and of course his wife." A cold silence settled over the room. Giraud let out a curse. "Beatrice Morel." Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet there is still one piece missing. The missing fingerprint." A revelation. Poirot turned to Marchand. "Monsieur, there is something peculiar about this case. Morel was shot at close range, yet there was one missing fingerprint. The killer's." Marchand paled. "That is strange." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Unless, of course, the killer was wearing gloves." Giraud scoffed. "What does that tell us? Gloves are common." Poirot smiled knowingly. "Oui, but not all gloves are equal." He gestured toward the butler. "Henri, fetch me Madame Morel's wardrobe." Henri nodded and left the room, returning moments later with a single pair of black satin gloves. Poirot held them up delicately. "D'abord, Morel was wearing these last night, was she not?" Henri nodded hesitantly. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. She often wore them at dinner." Poirot examined the delicate material, then abruptly turned to Marchand. "Monsieur, Morel withdrew his money, but he never collected it. Do you know why?" Marchand hesitated. I don't know. Poirot's voice was almost gentle. Because he was killed before he could, and whoever killed him must have known about the withdrawal. He turned sharply to Giraud. Bring me Beatrice Morel, now. A confrontation minutes later, Beatrice Morel was led into the parlour. She was pale, yet composed. Poirot studied her. Madame, I have been considering the psychology of this crime. Tell me, why did you not mention your husband's financial dealings? She stiffened. Because they were none of my concern. Poirot's voice was soft, yet unrelenting. And yet you knew about them. Beatrice's lips parted slightly, but she did not respond. Poirot continued. Morel tried to withdraw all his money, but he never had the chance. That means, madame, that someone killed him before he could act. Beatrice's hands clenched. Are you accusing me, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot stood. Madame, I never accuse without proof. He stepped closer. But I ask you, why were you outside the study before the others arrived? Beatrice's breath caught. I wasn't. Poirot smiled gently. Celeste Bernard saw you. Beatrice's face turned white. Poirot's voice softened even further. You wore gloves, madame, did you not? She blinked rapidly. I... Poirot lifted the black satin gloves. These, perhaps? A chilling silence filled the air. Poirot's gaze did not waver. Beatrice Morel, you were in the study that night, and you killed your husband. Beatrice's composure shattered. I had no choice, she gasped. He was going to leave me with nothing. Giraud grabbed her wrist. You're under arrest, Madame Morel. Poirot sighed, adjusting his cuffs. Murder is never the solution, madame, not even for love. Chapter 6. The Final Deception. The air in Villa Morel felt heavier, thick with tension. The moment Beatrice Morel had broken down in tears and gasped, I had no choice, it seemed the case had reached its resolution. Commissaire Giraud had seized her by the wrist, already calling for his men to take her into custody. And yet, Hercule Poirot was not satisfied. He remained seated, fingers pressed together, eyes narrowed in deep thought. He watched as Beatrice, still trembling, was escorted out of the parlour, her face pale as death. The moment the door closed behind her, Poirot shook his head. No, 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 he murmured under his breath. Giraud, now convinced of the case's conclusion, turned to him with a smirk. You see, Poirot, a confession, and without any of your little grey cells nonsense. Poirot slowly rose, smoothing the lapels of his jacket. And yet, my dear Giraud, a confession made under pressure, without a full explanation, is worth very little, Giraud scoffed. The woman admitted she killed him. What more do you want? Poirot gave him a steely look. The truth, mon ami. And this is not the truth. A shocked silence followed. Giraud frowned. What are you saying? You think Beatrice Morel didn't kill her husband? Poirot let out a small sigh. Oh, no. She was there. She certainly has guilt upon her soul. His voice lowered. But she did not fire the fatal shot. Giraud stared at him. Impossible. Poirot turned and slowly walked toward the study, his steps measured, his eyes distant. Come, Giraud, let us walk once more into the den of the crime. Reconstructing the crime, Poirot entered Francois Morel's study. now devoid of the crime, scene's former chaos. The chalk outline of the body had been erased, the furniture repositioned, the faint scent of cigar smoke still lingering. He stood near the mahogany desk where Morel had been shot. His fingers trailed along the polished surface, his eyes scanning every detail with a newfound intensity. "Let us return to the moment of the murder," Poirot murmured. "Madame Morel was indeed present. That much is true." Giraud folded his arms. "But she lied about being in her room. That proves guilt." Poirot turned abruptly. "Non, mon ami. It proves she had a reason to hide the truth, but not necessarily that she was the murderer." Giraud frowned. "Then why did she lie?" Poirot smiled. "Enfin, the right question. She lied because she saw something she was not meant to see." Giraud stiffened. "Saw what?" Poirot tapped his temple. "That, my dear Giraud, is what we must uncover." Poirot moved toward the study's window, where the heavy drapes hung motionless. He gently pulled one aside, revealing a small smudge on the glass, a faint fingerprint barely visible. He turned to Giraud. "This window, my friend, it is the key." Giraud's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Poirot faced him fully, his eyes sharp with realization. The murderer was not inside the study. The fatal shot was fired from outside. An impossible shot? Giraud's mouth opened, then closed. He stepped forward, peering out the window, trying to see what Poirot had seen. "From the garden? That's absurd. There's no way someone could have fired through this window and hit Morel cleanly." Poirot let out a soft chuckle. "You underestimate the power of precision, mon ami." He pointed at the fireplace, where a silver candlestick stood. "Imagine you are aiming not at a man, but at a fixed reflection." Giraud's eyes widened. "You mean?" Poirot nodded. The killer did not shoot Morel directly. They aimed at his reflection in the glass. A stunned silence filled the study. Giraud turned back to the window, looking at the faint fingerprint. "Then, that means Beatrice Morel couldn't have been the one who fired the gun." Poirot shook his head. "No, my friend, she was inside the room. She saw Morel fall. She saw the blood. She panicked." Giraud's face darkened. "Then who was outside?" Poirot turned, his eyes gleaming. "That, mon ami, is what we must determine." A night-time experiment Poirot, never one to leave matters unfinished, immediately organized a night-time reconstruction of the crime. The villa's grounds were cleared of any onlookers, and the study was restored to the exact conditions of the murder night. The lighting dimmed, the window drapes arranged just as they had been. Poirot positioned himself inside, the study standing precisely where François Morel had been at the time of his death. He motioned for Giraud to step outside. "Now, my dear Giraud, imagine you are the killer," Poirot called out. "Stand 30 feet from the study window, just at the curve of the garden path." Giraud reluctantly obeyed, positioning himself at the designated spot. Poirot raised a finger. "Now, observe. If you were aiming for me, you would be looking not at me directly, but at my reflection in the glass." From outside, Giraud could see it. The faint, ghostly image of Poirot's silhouette reflected in the glass. Giraud's breath caught. "Mon Dieu!" Poirot nodded. With a silenced pistol, A skilled marksman could have easily fired through the glass, striking Morel in the heart. He turned to the butler, Henri, who stood nervously at the door. "Henri, remind me, who was outside that night?" Henri swallowed. Monsieur Victor, Morel's nephew. He was out walking the grounds." Poirot's moustache twitched. The true murderer. A short while later, Victor Dufresne was summoned to the parlour. He arrived appearing calm but slightly puzzled. "Monsieur Poirot, you asked to see me." Poirot studied him carefully. "Monsieur, I have reason to believe that the fatal shot that killed Francois Morel was fired from the garden." Victor stiffened. Poirot took a step forward. "And I also believe that on the night of the murder you were outside." Victor's face paled. I told you, I was taking a walk." Poirot nodded. "Oui. And where exactly did this walk take you?" Victor hesitated. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. "To the curve of the garden path, directly in front of the study window?" A tense silence stretched between them. Victor's hands curled into fists. "You have no proof." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, but we do. A single fingerprint, yours, left on the window pane." Victor visibly faltered. Poirot continued, his voice soft yet unyielding. "You planned it carefully. You waited until your uncle was at his desk. You knew that from outside his reflection would be visible in the glass. And when the moment was right, you fired." Victor's composure broke. I had no choice," he choked. "Morel was going to cut me out of his will. He planned to give everything to Beatrice. I was supposed to inherit—" His voice cracked. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "And so you killed him." Victor let out a long, shuddering breath. "Yes." Giraud stepped forward, his face grim. "Victor Dufresne, you are under arrest for the murder of Francois Morel." Victor did not resist. He simply closed his eyes. Poirot, ever composed, turned away as Giraud led Victor out of the villa. He adjusted his cuffs and sighed softly. "Murder, my friend, is never so simple as it seems." He turned toward the empty fireplace, his voice no more than a whisper. "The truth is always hidden, until one dares to look." Chapter 7. The Last Loose Ends. As Victor Dufresne was led away by the gendarmes, a heavy silence settled over Villemorel. The storm that had been brewing over the past days had finally broken, but its aftermath left behind questions still unanswered. Hercule Poirot, standing in the parlour with his immaculate poise, gently adjusted his cuffs and let out a measured sigh. Commissaire Giraud, still processing the shocking turn of events, folded his arms and shot Poirot a sharp look. "Well, Poirot, you got your man. What more is there?" Poirot arched a delicate eyebrow. "Mon ami, one does not simply close a case because an arrest has been made." Giraud frowned. "What are you talking about?" Poirot turned, surveying the gathered faces of those still present in the villa. Henri the butler, Madame Beatrice Morel, young Juliette Dufresne, and Dr. Armand Lefebvre. His keen eyes studied each one. "Tell me, my friends, does this case not seem, how shall I say, too perfect?" Giraud scowled. "You mean Victor confessed? What's not perfect about that?" Poirot smiled faintly. Oui, he confessed, but why? And more importantly, when? Giraud's expression darkened. You think he didn't do it? Oh, no, 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 mon cher Giraud. He is guilty, yes. But guilt is never so simple. It has layers. Poirot's fingers made a delicate motion, as if peeling an onion. He turned to Beatrice Morel, who sat silent and pale, her hands clasped together in her lap. Madame Morel, you have not spoken a word since the arrest. Beatrice looked up sharply. I must ask you, madam, what did you see that night? The truth unfolds. A tense pause followed. Beatrice looked around the room, her lips pressed together. Poirot took a step forward, his tone gentle yet insistent. You were there. You were in the study. His voice was soft, but held a power that demanded truth. And you saw something, did you not? Beatrice's fingers trembled against the fabric of her dress. Finally, she whispered, Yes. A murmur ran through the room. Giraud narrowed his eyes. What exactly did you see, Madame Morel? She took a deep breath. I came downstairs that night because I heard voices. My husband, he was arguing with someone. I thought at first it was the butler, et Henri, but then I realized it was Victor. Poirot nodded. Go on. Beatrice swallowed. I stood outside the door, listening. My husband was angry. He said something about cutting Victor off, and that he had already changed the will. Victor was furious. He told Francois that he would regret it. She let out a shaky breath. Then there was silence, a long silence, and suddenly her voice cracked. A gunshot. The room felt frozen in time. Giraud frowned. But if Victor fired from outside the window, then why didn't you see him? Beatrice shuddered. I don't know. The moment the shot rang out, I pushed open the door. My husband was already on the floor. I saw blood. And then her voice dropped to a whisper. I ran. A thick silence followed. Poirot studied her carefully. You were in shock. But tell me, madam, did you notice anything strange before you fled? Beatrice hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes, there was a glass of cognac on the table, my husband's. It had been knocked over. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, très intéressant. Giraud scowled. What does that prove? Poirot turned back toward the others. It tells us that Francois Morel was not merely sitting when he was shot. He was reaching for something, perhaps a weapon, or perhaps something had startled him. He turned his sharp gaze towards Dr. Armand Lefebvre. Doctor, he said smoothly, you were the first to examine the body, were you not? Dr. Lefebvre nodded. Yes, I was. Poirot tilted his head. And tell me, monsieur, how long would you estimate Morel had been dead when you arrived? Lefebvre frowned. About 20 minutes, perhaps a little more. Why? Poirot's moustache twitched. Because, mon cher docteur, by my calculations, that would mean he was shot at precisely. 10:20 p.m. A hush fell over the room. Beatrice blinked. Yes, that sounds right. Poirot turned to Juliette Dufresne, Victor's young sister. She had been silent this entire time, watching with wide, fearful eyes. Mademoiselle Dufresne, Poirot said gently, where were you at that time? Juliette stiffened. I was in my room, she said quickly. I went to bed early. Poirot stepped forward. "Ah, but I believe, mademoiselle, that you were not in your room." Juliet's face went white. "I believe," Poirot continued, "that you were in the hallway, and you saw something." Juliet took a step back. Poirot's voice was softer now, coaxing, patient. "Tell us, mademoiselle, what did you see?" Juliet was shaking. She looked around the room as if seeking escape. Then, finally, she broke. "I saw Victor," she whispered. "I saw him outside in the garden." The revelation shocked everyone. Poirot nodded. "And you knew, didn't you? You knew that he had fired the shot." Tears spilled from Juliet's eyes. "Yes." Beatrice gasped. Henri, the butler, clutched the edge of the table for support. Giraud stared at the young woman. "Why didn't you say anything?" Juliet's face crumpled. "He's my brother. I couldn't let him be arrested. I thought maybe someone else would take the blame." She looked at Beatrice, guilt shining in her eyes. "I thought they would accuse you," she confessed. Beatrice's lips parted in shock. Poirot shook his head. "Ah, ma pauvre fille, you thought you were protecting him, but in doing so, you nearly allowed an innocent woman to be convicted." Juliet burst into tears. Giraud, rubbing his temples, let out a long sigh. "So, that's it. That's the whole mess unravelled." Chapter 8. Shadows of the Past. The road away from Villa Morel was dark and silent, the night air carrying the scent of damp earth from the earlier rain. Poirot walked with deliberate steps, his mind still sifting through the final remnants of the case. Beside him, Inspector Giraud exhaled sharply, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Well, that's that," he muttered. "Victor Dufresne will face trial. Beatrice Morel is cleared. And Juliet, well, she'll have to live with what she did." Poirot tut-tutted, shaking his head. "You see only the surface, mon ami. But beneath, there is always more." Giraud groaned. "Poirot, can't you just be satisfied that we got the right man?" Poirot halted, turning to face him. "Tell me, Giraud, have you ever considered what drives a man to commit murder?" Giraud frowned. "Greed, revenge, fear, the usual things." Poirot nodded slowly. "Oui, but there is something else, desperation." Giraud's scowl deepened. "What are you getting at?" Poirot sighed and resumed walking. Victor did not kill François Morel out of mere greed. He killed him because he felt he had no other choice. The weight of desperation. The next morning, Poirot sat in the study of his modest apartment in Paris, sipping his perfectly prepared tisane. His fingers tapped against the porcelain cup as he reread the details of the case in his notebook. There was something about the events at Villa Morel that lingered in his mind. He had spent a lifetime unravelling the motives of men and women who had crossed the line into murder, and in nearly every case he found the same truth, a heart filled with desperation, believing that no other path remained. Victor Dufresne had been on the brink of ruin, a failed business, a growing mountain of debt, a sister he felt responsible for. And then, in the middle of it all, the final blow, his wealthy father-in-law cutting him off entirely. "Ah," Poirot murmured to himself, setting down his cup. The mind of a desperate man is the most dangerous of all. He leaned back, eyes drifting, toward the window. The streets of Paris bustled below, filled with people moving through their own quiet struggles, their own unseen battles. How many, he wondered, were standing at the edge of desperation even now? A visitor. Arrives a sharp knock at the door broke Poirot's thoughts. "Enter," he called. The door swung open, revealing Juliette Dufresne. She stood in the doorway, looking smaller than she had at Villa Morel. Her hands were clasped before her, and her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly. He stood immediately, offering her a seat. "Mademoiselle, what brings you here?" She hesitated before stepping inside, sitting gingerly on the chair across from him. "I had to see you," she murmured. "I needed to understand." Poirot tilted his head. "Understand what, mademoiselle?" Her hands clenched together in her lap. Why Victor did it? He was always kind to me. He always said he'd protect me. And yet, her voice broke. Poirot studied her carefully before speaking. "Your brother loved you, mademoiselle. In his own way, he wished to shield you from suffering." Juliette swallowed hard. "But he became the very thing he swore to protect me from." Poirot nodded slowly. "Indeed, the road to crime is often paved with good intentions turned sour." Juliette looked down. "I keep thinking, if I had stopped him, if I had told someone sooner." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "You cannot change the past, mademoiselle. You can only choose what you do with the truth you now carry." Juliette lifted her gaze, her eyes shimmering. "What do I do now?" Poirot smiled softly. "You live, you learn, and most importantly, you seek to do what is right, even when it is difficult." Juliette exhaled shakily. "I will try." Poirot gave a small nod. "That is all one can do, mademoiselle." She rose to leave, but before stepping out, she turned back. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for finding the truth." Poirot inclined his head. "The truth, mademoiselle, always has a way of revealing itself." As the door closed behind her, Poirot sat back down, staring at the spot where she had been a year. Echoes of Villa Morel still lingered, but the case was closed. And so, Hercule Poirot turned his thoughts to the next mystery awaiting him. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. The grey morning in Paris was quiet, with a slight chill in the air. Poirot sat at his desk, perfectly pressed suit immaculate, sipping his usual tisane. Though the case of Francois Morel's murder was closed, something about it still lingered in his mind. He tapped a finger thoughtfully against his porcelain cup. Victor Dufresne had confessed. The motive was clear, the evidence undeniable. Yet a small voice within Poirot whispered that something had been left unseen. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Poirot set his cup down and straightened his cuffs before calling out, "Entrez!" The door opened, and Captain Arthur Hastings stepped in, his expression one of mild exasperation. "Poirot, I've just read about the Morel case in the papers," he said, tossing a newspaper onto the desk. "It all seems neatly wrapped up, doesn't it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Indeed, mon ami, you sound almost disappointed." Hastings sat down across from him, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "Well, I suppose I am. I know you, Poirot. Cases rarely end so tidily." Poirot's green eyes gleamed. "Ah, Hastings, you know me well. It is true, there is something that remains unsettled." Hastings raised an eyebrow. "But Victor Dufresne confessed, didn't he?" "Oui." Poirot nodded. "And yet, why do I feel that the story is not entirely finished?" Hastings frowned. "What exactly is troubling you?" Poirot steepled his fingers. "Tell me, mon ami, what do you recall about the crime scene?" Hastings shrugged. "Not much beyond what you told me. Francois Morel was killed in his study, shot at close range. The door was locked from the inside, and the room was in disarray, suggesting a struggle." Poirot nodded. "Très bien. But consider this. If Morel struggled, why did no one hear the commotion?" Hastings blinked. "Come to think of it, that is odd. A struggle like that should have made noise, shouldn't it?" Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And yet no one heard a thing. Does that not strike you as peculiar?" Hastings stared at him. "You mean Victor Dufresne might not be the killer after all?" Poirot's gaze darkened. "That, mon ami, is exactly what I intend to find out." A conversation with Beatrice Morel later that day. Poirot and Hastings took a carriage to the Morel estate. Though the house no longer hummed with tension, there was a lingering sense of unease in the air. Beatrice Morel greeted them in the drawing-room, dressed in mourning black. Her expression was unreadable. "Messieurs," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "What brings you back? I thought the case was over." Poirot gave her a polite bow before settling into his chair. "Madame, you are quite correct. Victor Dufresne has confessed, and yet there remains a small matter which disturbs me." Beatrice's brows furrowed slightly. "What matter?" Poirot watched her closely. "I must ask you, madame, did you truly hear nothing the night of your husband's murder?" She hesitated just for a moment before answering. "No, Monsieur Poirot. As I said before, I was in my chambers." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And yet your husband was a strong man, was he not? If he struggled, surely there would have been some noise?" Beatrice's fingers tightened on the armrest of her chair. "I do not know what to tell you, monsieur. I heard nothing." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Curious, Hastings, who had been watching the exchange, spoke up. "Madam, forgive me, but do you believe Victor was truly capable of murdering your husband?" Beatrice's lips pressed together. I do not know. He was desperate, angry, but I never thought him a killer." Poirot watched her intently. "And yet, someone did kill your husband." Her eyes flickered for a moment. A hesitation, a shadow of something unspoken. Poirot nodded slowly. "That will be all for now, madame. Merci." As they left, Hastings leaned close to Poirot. "She's hiding something, isn't she?" Poirot murmured. "Oh, mon ami, I fear we have overlooked the most dangerous suspect of all." The forgotten. Clue back in his study, Poirot sat in deep thought. He flipped through his notes, eyes scanning over the details, and then suddenly he stopped. His finger rested on a single line, a detail so small that it had seemed insignificant before. Deemed Eve, only fingerprint missing from the crime scene was Francois Morel's. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A man is murdered in his own study. His belongings are scattered, suggesting a struggle. And yet, when the room is examined, his own fingerprints are missing. A slow smile spread across Poirot's face. "Ah," he murmured. "C'est magnifique! The missing fingerprint! How very clever!" Hastings looked up from across the room. "Poirot, what are you on about?" Poirot stood abruptly, eyes flashing with triumph. "Hastings, my friend, we have been misled. Victor Dufresne is not the murderer. The crime was staged to make him look guilty." Hastings's jaw dropped. "Then who—" Poirot turned toward him, face grave. "There's only one person who had the means, the motive, and the intelligence to pull this off." Hastings swallowed hard. "Poirot, you don't mean—" Poirot nodded. "Yes, mon ami. The true killer is Beatrice Morel." Chapter 10. Poirot's masterstroke, the evening. Sky over Paris was painted in hues of crimson and violet, as Hercule Poirot made his final preparations. His mind, ever methodical, had unravelled the intricate web of deception that had been carefully spun. Now it was time to draw the curtain back and reveal the truth. In the grand drawing-room of the Morel estate, a tense assembly awaited him. The suspects Beatrice Morel, the grieving widow, her face pale and unreadable. Victor Dufresne, the wrongly accused, his eyes filled with confusion and desperation. Inspector Lefebvre, sceptical but intrigued. Jacques Morel, François Morel's younger brother, standing by the fireplace with an impatient air. Sophie Langlois, the maid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Émile Giraud, Morel's business partner, who sat with arms crossed, exuding irritation. And of course, Captain Hastings, who watched Poirot with an air of expectation. Poirot took his place at the centre of the room, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his perfectly tailored cuffs before clasping his hands together. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but authoritative, "the time has come to uncover the truth. 1. The web of lie Victor Dufresne, still recovering from his wrongful imprisonment, spoke up first. "Poirot, I don't understand. I confessed. The case is over, isn't it?" Poirot shook his head gravely. "Non, monsieur. The case is far from over." A murmur ran through the room. Beatrice Morel's eyes flickered, but she remained composed. Poirot continued, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "There was something that troubled me from the beginning, mes amis. François Morel was a strong man. He was attacked in his study. The room was in disarray, suggesting a struggle. And yet he paused, his green eyes gleaming. No one heard anything. Inspector Lefebvre frowned. "Yes, and?" Poirot lifted a finger. "Ah, but that is impossible, mon cher. A struggle of that nature would have surely made a noise. A shout, a crash, something. But there was only silence." Hastings's brow furrowed. "You mean Morel didn't struggle?" Poirot nodded. "Exactement. That means he knew his attacker. He did not expect danger." His gaze shifted to Beatrice Morel. "Madame Morel, does this not strike you as peculiar?" Beatrice's fingers tensed against her dress, but she kept her expression neutral. I don't know what you mean." Poirot smiled thinly. "Oh, I think you do, madame." The missing fingerprint Poirot turned to the assembled guests. Now, let us consider another oddity. The missing fingerprint. Émile Giraud scoffed. I still don't see what that has to do with anything. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Ah, monsieur, but it is the most important clue of all. You see, when the police examined François Morel's study, they found fingerprints belonging to nearly everyone in this room. On the desk, the bookshelves, even the whiskey decanter. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. But the one person's fingerprints that were completely absent? A pause. François Morel's own. A wave of disbelief swept through the room. Hastings let out a gasp. Lefebvre's eyes widened. Victor, Dufresne whispered, That doesn't make sense. Beatrice Morel remained motionless. Poirot nodded. Oui, it is most strange, n'est-ce pas? A man who lives in that room, who touches everything daily, and yet his fingerprints were nowhere to be found. His voice hardened. That is because someone erased them. A sharp intake of breath came from Sophie Langlois. The maid, Poirot, turned his gaze to her. Mademoiselle Langlois, did you clean Monsieur Morel's study on the day of his death? She shook her head quickly. No, monsieur. Madame Beatrice told me not to enter that morning. Poirot smiled knowingly. Ah, very interesting indeed. His eyes flicked back to Beatrice. Madame Morel, do you not find that curious? The truth unveiled. A heavy silence hung in the air. Beatrice Morel's hands trembled slightly, but she still said nothing. Poirot straightened, his voice ringing with finality. Here is what truly happened, mes amis. Everyone leaned in, their attention fixed on him. Poirot clasped his hands together. François Morel was indeed murdered, but not by Victor Dufresne. No, he was killed by someone he trusted, someone close enough to stand before him without raising suspicion. He turned, his piercing gaze locking onto Beatrice Morel. The true murderer is you, madam. The room exploded in gasps. Victor Dufresne jumped to his feet. Lefebvre stared in shock. Hastings gaped. Beatrice Morel, however, sat completely still. Poirot pressed forward. You killed your husband, madame, and then you did something extraordinary. You wiped down every surface he touched, ensuring that his fingerprints were gone. Why? Because when the police found his prints nowhere, it would suggest that the room had been staged. His eyes gleamed. And that, madame, was your mistake. It was too perfect. Beatrice's fingers curled tightly into the fabric of her dress. You're insane, Poirot, she whispered. Poirot only smiled gently. No, madame, I am only very observant. The motive and the final blow, Hastings, still reeling, shook his head. But why? Why would she kill her own husband? Poirot sighed. Ah, mon ami, is it not obvious? Money, control, revenge. He turned to the room. François Morel was an unfaithful man. He spent years humiliating his wife with affairs. Beatrice had tolerated it for so long. But when she learned that he planned to leave her, divorce her for another woman, she snapped. Poirot's eyes darkened. Did you think I would not notice, madame? You knew divorce would leave you with nothing. You planned the crime carefully. You made sure Victor would take the blame, because he had a motive. And when the time came, you executed it perfectly. A horrified silence filled the air. Finally, Beatrice Morel let out a slow breath. Then she smiled. It was a smile without warmth, without remorse. Well, she said softly, You are very clever, Monsieur Poirot." Victor Dufresne stared at her in disbelief. "Beatrice, you—" She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You were always a fool, Victor. Always." Poirot straightened, eyes glittering. "Inspector Lefebvre, I believe you have all the evidence you need." Lefebvre stood slowly, his face grim. "Beatrice Morel, you are under arrest." Beatrice's smile faded. As the inspector stepped forward, she sighed. "I suppose it is over, then?" Poirot nodded. "Oui, madame, it is over." 5. The departure and final reflection. As Poirot and Hastings walked along the Seine, Hastings let out a long breath. "I still can't believe it. She nearly got away with it." Poirot nodded. "Oui, mon ami. But murder, you see, is never perfect. There is always a flaw." Hastings chuckled. "And you always find it." Poirot smiled. "Naturellement." He adjusted his cuffs, his mind already moving to the next puzzle. For no mystery, no deception, could ever truly outmatch the mind of Hercule Poirot. Chapter 11. Shadows in the Fog. The cold mist of an early London morning coiled through the streets, wrapping the city in an eerie embrace. The lamps flickered dimly, their glow barely piercing the thick fog that had settled over Baker Street. Within the familiar walls of Tomb 21B, Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, the sharp scent of pipe smoke curling around him like an say, "Hey, old friend." Dr. John Watson, standing by the window, shivered slightly and pulled his dressing-gown closer. "Holmes," he murmured, "this fog is wretched. I can hardly see beyond the lamp-post." Holmes, his piercing eyes half hidden behind the rising smoke, merely smiled. "Excellent," he said, his voice carrying an almost amused tone. "Fog has a way of concealing secrets, Watson, and tonight we shall uncover one." Watson turned to him, an eyebrow raised. "A case?" Holmes leaned forward, retrieving an envelope from the table. "Indeed, my dear friend. A most curious message. Arrived just before dawn. Read it aloud." Watson took the letter and unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read the words, scrawled in hasty ink. "Mr. Holmes, a matter of utmost urgency demands your attention. A life is at stake. A shadow moves where none should exist. Meet me at the Docklands, before midnight, alone. Trust no one." A friend Watson looked up, his expression sceptical. "Holmes, this is absurd. Who sends such a cryptic message without signing their name?" Holmes chuckled. "Precisely why I find it fascinating, Watson. A nameless friend, a warning, a meeting in the dead of night. How could I resist?" Watson sighed, knowing there was little hope of dissuading his companion. "And I suppose you intend to go?" Holmes stood, his movements as fluid as a panther's. "I would be a poor detective indeed if I did not." Watson hesitated. "The letter says to come alone." Holmes gave him a knowing look. "Which is precisely why you shall accompany me." 1. The Docklands. Encounter by midnight. Holmes and Watson found themselves at the edge of the Thames, where the docks stretched out like skeletal fingers into the black water. The fog had thickened, swallowing the streets in a dense shroud. The air was damp, filled with the distant echoes of ship horns and the occasional splash of unseen movement. Watson tugged his coat tighter around himself. "This place is positively ghastly," he muttered. Holmes, in contrast, seemed invigorated by the mystery. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, gesturing ahead. A lone figure stands beneath the lantern, just as promised. Indeed, through the swirling fog, a shadowed figure loomed near the wooden crates. A man, dressed in a long overcoat, his hat pulled low over his face. Holmes approached, his footsteps eerily silent on the damp cobblestones. "You requested my presence," he called. "I am here." The figure turned slightly, but his face remained obscured by shadow. "Sherlock Holmes." Holmes nodded. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir." The man hesitated, then took a step closer. "I had no choice but to contact you. I have information, but I fear I am already being watched." His voice trembled. Watson tensed. "Watched? By whom?" Before the man could answer, a gunshot shattered the silence. The stranger staggered backward, clutching his chest. A dark stain spread across his coat as he crumpled to the ground. Watson rushed forward, but Holmes's hand shot out, stopping him. "No sudden moves, Watson. We are not alone." Through the fog, faint footsteps retreated into the night. Holmes's keen eyes darted across the scene, scanning for the shooter. But whoever had fired the fatal shot had already vanished. Watson knelt beside the fallen man, pressing 2 fingers to his throat. He looked up grimly. "He's gone, Holmes." Holmes exhaled sharply. "How very inconvenient." Watson frowned. "A man has just been murdered, and you call it inconvenient." Holmes's sharp gaze lifted. "Yes, Watson, because he was our only lead." The only clue Holmes crouched beside the body, searching the man's pockets with meticulous precision. No wallet, no identification. Whoever he was, he had taken great care to remain anonymous. But then, Holmes's fingers brushed against something, a small folded note tucked inside the man's sleeve. Holmes unfolded it carefully. The ink was smudged with blood, but the words were still legible. "Beware the one who walks in 2 shadows." Watson read over his shoulder. "What the devil does that mean?" Holmes's expression darkened. "It means we are dealing with something far more elaborate than a simple murder." Etienne stood abruptly. "Come, Watson, we have work to do." 3. The House of Mirrors. The following morning, after a restless night of deductions, Holmes led Watson to a peculiar location, the House of Mirrors, an exclusive gentlemen's club known for its air of secrecy. Holmes strode inside without hesitation. The interior was lavish. Gold chandeliers, velvet curtains, and mirrored walls that reflected distorted images of their occupants. A tall, broad-shouldered man behind the counter eyed them with suspicion. "You're not members." Holmes smiled. "And yet, here we are." The man folded his arms. "State your business, Holmes." Holmes glanced around the room, then leaned in slightly. "We seek a man who walks in 2 shadows." The doorman stiffened. Holmes noted the reaction with satisfaction. "Ah, so you do know something." The man hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "I don't know who you are, but if you value your life, you'll leave now." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "That, I'm afraid, is not an option." Before the doorman could respond, a sudden crash echoed through the room. A masked figure burst in from the back entrance, a knife gleaming in his hand. Watson barely had time to react before Holmes moved, grabbing a nearby cane and striking with precision. The masked man stumbled, but not before tossing something onto the floor, a small silver locket. The attacker fled before anyone could stop him. Holmes picked up the locket, turning it over in his fingers. A single word was engraved on the back. "Eleanor, Watson," catching his breath, muttered, "What now, Holmes?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Now, my dear Watson, we find Eleanor. Issue 4. The Final Revelation." By nightfall, their investigation led them to an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of London. The air smelled of damp stone and decay. Holmes pushed the heavy doors open. Inside, standing beneath the fractured light of a stained-glass window, was a woman dressed in black. "Eleanor," Holmes called. She turned, her face pale but composed. "You should not have come." Holmes took a step forward. "You are the key to all of this, aren't you?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "I tried to stop him." Watson frowned. "Stop who?" a deep voice answered from the shadows. "Me." A figure emerged, a man dressed in fine clothing, but his face was disturbingly familiar. Watson's breath caught. "Holmes, he looks exactly like—" Holmes nodded grimly. "Yes, Watson, that is why he walks in two shadows." For the man standing before them was the very twin of the dead stranger at the docks. And now, the final act of this deadly game had begun. Chapter 12. The Man with Two Shadows. The revelation hung thick in the air, like the fog that clung to the streets of London outside. Watson stared at the man before them, identical to the victim who had died at the docks the night before, the same chiseled jawline, the same piercing eyes. The only difference was the cold smile that now curled across his lips. Holmes, ever composed, studied him with razor-sharp precision. "So," he murmured, "the man who walks in two shadows finally steps into the light." The stranger chuckled, stepping forward. The wooden floor of the abandoned chapel creaked beneath his boots. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, "I must admit, you are quicker than I anticipated." Eleanor, standing beside the stranger, clutched the silver locket Holmes had recovered at the House of Mirrors. Her face was pale, her fingers trembling. Watson, regaining his composure, took a step forward. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man tilted his head. "You already know, Doctor. I am the ghost of the man who died at the docks." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Nonsense! Ghosts do not exist, but twins do." A slow clap echoed through the vast space. "Bravo, Mr. Holmes," the man said. "You are correct. My name is Edgar Blackwood, and the man who died last night was my twin brother, Edwin Blackwood." Watson inhaled sharply. "A twin?" Holmes folded his arms. "I assume the two of you were involved in something illicit, and when Edwin decided to betray the arrangement, he was silenced." Edgar smiled, but his eyes remained devoid of warmth. "You assume much, Detective, but there is more to this than you realize." Holmes gestured toward Eleanor. "Then perhaps Miss Eleanor would care to enlighten us." She flinched at the sound of her name. She glanced toward Edgar as if seeking permission to speak. Edgar placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture more possessive than comforting. "Go on, Eleanor," he said softly. "Tell them." Holmes took a step forward. "Who are you, Eleanor? And what do you have to do with the death of Edwin Blackwood?" She hesitated before finally whispering, "I am Edwin's fiancée." Watson's eyebrows shot up. "Good heavens!" Eleanor's voice wavered. "We were to be married in secret. But then, Edwin, he found out the truth. And that was his mistake." Holmes's expression hardened. "What? Truth?" Edgar's cold laugh cut through the air. "The truth, Mr. Holmes, is that Edwin was never meant to live." Watson stiffened. "What?" Holmes's eyes darkened. "You mean, from the beginning, only one of you was meant to survive?" Toad's smile widened. "You see, Detective, we were born to a father who believed that only one heir should inherit his empire. So, from childhood, Edwin and I were pitted against each other, a ruthless contest of wit, charm, and deception. Father always said that only one of us would walk away." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "But Edwin didn't want to play the game anymore. He wanted to run away with me." Holmes's voice was as sharp as a blade. "And so you killed him?" Edgar's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "I had to, Mr. Holmes. He was weak. He tried to expose me. The rules were clear. Only one of us could remain." Watson clenched his fists. "You're a madman." Holmes, however, remained impassive. "And yet, Mr. Blackwood, you did not account for one thing." Edgar arched an eyebrow. "Oh, and what is that?" Holmes's gaze flickered to Eleanor. "A guilty conscience." The betrayal all eyes turned to Eleanor. She stepped away from Edgar, her body trembling. "Holmes is right. I can't do this any more." Edgar's expression darkened. "Eleanor." She took another step back. "I loved Edwin. He was nothing like you. He was kind. And now he's dead because of you." Holmes spoke softly. "Miss Eleanor, I believe you have something that will prove Edgar's guilt beyond any doubt." She hesitated, then slowly lifted the silver locket. Holmes gestured to it. "Open it." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she did. Inside was a folded slip of paper. Edgar's expression turned to fury. "Eleanor, you—" She took a deep breath and read aloud. "If I am found dead, know this. My brother, Edgar, is responsible. He walks in two shadows, deceiving all. But he cannot deceive you. Edwin Blackwood." The room fell deathly silent. Edgar's face contorted with rage. "You little—" Before he could lunge at her, Holmes swiftly pulled a revolver from his coat. "I would reconsider your actions," Holmes said coldly. Edgar froze. His hands clenched at his sides. His breath came in ragged gasps. Watson moved to Eleanor's side, steadying her. "It's over, Blackwood." Edgar's expression twisted into something ugly. "No, not yet." And in the blink of an eye, he bolted towards the nearest window. Holmes shouted, "Stop him!" But Edgar was fast. He leapt through the stained-glass window, shards of colour cascading through the air as he disappeared into the night. The chase through the fog Holmes and Watson raced out of the chapel. Eleanor close behind. The fog was thick, curling around them like living tendrils. "There!" Watson pointed. Edgar's silhouette flickered in and out of sight as he dashed through the abandoned streets. Holmes's voice was calm but urgent. "He knows these alleys well. We must cut him off." They followed swiftly, boots echoing against the cobblestones. Then, a sharp cry. They turned a corner and stopped dead. Edgar Blackwood lay sprawled in the street, blood pooling beneath him. A knife protruded from his chest. Holmes knelt beside the body, his expression unreadable. So it ends. Watson scanned the surrounding fog, but saw no one. Who could have... Holmes lifted the locket from Edgar's fingers. It was open. Inside was a newly placed note. Holmes read it aloud. There were always meant to be 2 shadows. Now there are none. Watson shuddered. My God! Someone wanted him silenced. Holmes slipped the locket into his pocket. A fitting end for a man who built his life on deception. Eleanor stood in stunned silence. Then, in a trembling voice, she whispered, "It's over." Holmes exhaled, watching as the fog began to lift. "Yes, Miss Eleanor," he murmured. "For better or for worse, it is over." Epilogue. A final reflection. 2 days later, Holmes and Watson sat by the fireplace at 221B Baker Street. Watson stared into the flames. "Do you think we'll ever know who killed Edgar?" Holmes sipped his tea. Perhaps, or perhaps it is best left a mystery. Watson frowned. "That doesn't sound like you." Holmes smiled faintly. "Even I must admit, Watson, that some shadows should remain in the fog." Watson sighed, then raised his glass. "To Edwin Blackwood, who tried to escape his fate." Holmes nodded solemnly. "To the man who walked in 2 shadows." The fire crackled softly, as outside the London fog rolled on, keeping its secrets. Well, Chapter 13. The Final Puzzle. Unravelled, the case had been resolved, the culprit unmasked, and justice seemingly served. Hercule Poirot, ever composed, had delivered his masterful revelation before an astonished audience. Inspector Japp had led the guilty party away in handcuffs, leaving behind a house filled with shaken souls and a lingering sense of unease. So the guests began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the astonishing unravelling of deception. Captain Hastings could not shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. He had witnessed Poirot's deductions time and again, but this case, despite its seemingly neat conclusion, left a strange taste in his mouth. Poirot, seated comfortably in an armchair by the grand fireplace of Ashcombe Manor, regarded the flickering flames with an inscrutable expression. He twirled the ends of his moustache, his eyes distant yet alert. Hastings cleared his throat. "Well, Poirot, that was a rather thrilling conclusion, I must say. But you seem rather pensive. Surely all is well now?" Poirot arched an eyebrow. "Ah, mon ami, you know me too well. Indeed, we have solved the case, and yet there is an element that remains, how shall we say, un peu étrange." Hastings frowned. "But you exposed the murderer. The missing fingerprint was a ruse. The true deception lay in the psychological misdirection rather than physical evidence." "Oui, precisely," Poirot agreed, nodding. "But there is something I overlooked, a thread left dangling, and Hercule Poirot does not like loose threads." Hastings sank into a chair opposite his friend, feeling a familiar sensation, the moment before Poirot delivered an unexpected revelation. "What are you suggesting?" Poirot tapped his temple. "Tell me, Hastings, what was the very first anomaly in this case?" Hastings thought for a moment. The missing fingerprint, of course. Exactament. And tell me, my dear friend, why does a person remove a fingerprint from a crime scene? To avoid identification, Hastings replied at once. Poirot steepled his fingers, his gaze piercing. Bien. And yet, the person we arrested, they had no need to remove their fingerprint. The evidence against them was circumstantial at best, built upon contradictions, psychology, and motive rather than forensic proof. Alors, why then was the fingerprint erased at all? Hastings blinked. But surely... He paused, realization dawning. Good Lord, Poirot, are you saying... Poirot gave a satisfied nod. Oui, mon ami. I fear we have caught a murderer, but perhaps not the murderer. A visitor in the night before Hastings could fully process Poirot's words. A soft knock interrupted them. The butler, looking nervous, stepped in. Sir, there is a lady to see you. She says it is urgent. Poirot and Hastings exchanged a glance. A lady? At this hour? The butler hesitated. She said you would understand. It's Miss Evelyn March. Miss Evelyn March, the quiet, unassuming governess who had been dismissed early in the case as an unlikely suspect. Poirot leaned forward. Ah, show her in at once. Moments later, Evelyn March stepped inside, her face pale but her eyes determined. She clutched a small bundle in her hands. Mr. Poirot, she said in a trembling voice, I had to come. There's something you must see. She placed the bundle on the table. Poirot unwrapped it with careful hands. Inside was a delicate lace-trimmed handkerchief, stained with blood. Hastings inhaled sharply. Good heavens! Poirot's eyes gleamed. And where did you find this, mademoiselle? She hesitated, then whispered, In Lady Ashcombe's room, hidden inside the lining of her writing desk. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Poirot turned the fabric over, studying it with intense scrutiny. Then he spoke, his voice quieter than usual, but brimming with certainty. Hastings, we must pay Lady Ashcombe one final visit. A killer, among them Lady Ashcombe, received them in her private parlour, where she had retreated after the dramatic events of the evening. She was composed, regal, a woman accustomed to authority. Mr. Poirot, she said coolly, to what do I owe the pleasure? Poirot placed the bloodied handkerchief on the table between them. Her eyes flickered, just for an instant. Poirot smiled, gently. You have been most clever, milady, most clever indeed. She did not respond. Poirot continued. I knew there was something amiss the moment I considered the missing fingerprint. It did not belong to the arrested man at all. It belonged to someone else, someone who needed to erase it, not to escape justice, but to ensure that the investigation followed the wrong trail. Hastings felt his heart pounding. Poirot leaned forward. You loved him, did you not? Lady Ashcombe's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. I do not know what you mean, she said quietly. Poirot nodded. You knew that if the truth came out, it would destroy everything, and so you did the only thing you could. You misdirected us. You allowed another to take the blame. But even the most careful deception leaves its trace. The blood on this handkerchief, it tells the true story. A long silence. Then she exhaled, a slow and weary breath. You are right, Mr. Poirot, she murmured. Hastings gaped. "You mean you are the real—" Lady Ashcombe's eyes were distant. "I did not mean to, but it was inevitable." Poirot gave a small, sad nod. "And now, milady, the truth must be known." A flicker of something passed across her face. Then, suddenly, she reached for a small vial on the table. Poirot reacted instantly. "No, madame, that is not the way." But it was too late. With a calm, resolute expression, Lady Ashcombe drank the liquid in one swift motion. She set the vial down gently, looked at Poirot with something like gratitude, and whispered, "At least now the secret dies with me." She slumped back, her breathing slowing. The poison took effect swiftly. Poirot closed his eyes, his expression unreadable. Poirot's final reflection turned beneath the cold night sky. Hastings lit a cigarette with a shaking hand. "She did it to protect someone," he murmured, "but in the end she chose her own justice." Poirot, standing beside him, sighed. "The human heart, Hastings, it is the most treacherous of all. Even the keenest mind cannot always predict its course." Hastings exhaled a plume of smoke. "Well, at least it is over." Poirot turned his gaze to the moonlit manor, his eyes unreadable. "Yes," he said softly, "it is over." And yet, in the depths of his mind, the little grey cells whispered that some mysteries never truly end. Chapter 14. The Vanishing Footsteps. The late afternoon sun cast a long shadow across the bustling streets of London, the cool autumn breeze carrying the promise of an early evening. The crowds were thinner now, and the sound of distant carriages echoed in the streets, punctuated by the occasional honk of an automobile horn. It was, as always, a city of contradictions, quiet moments wedged between the noise of human existence. In one of the city's finer districts on the edge of Mayfair, Hercule Poirot sat in a finely upholstered armchair, surveying the room with his customary air of quiet contemplation. His hands rested delicately on his lap, the fingers folded with the precision of a man who was accustomed to maintaining order in his surroundings. Before him, in a tidy row, lay the remnants of a case that had baffled Scotland Yard for nearly a week. The case was a strange one indeed. A young woman, Miss Evelyn Hargrave, had disappeared from her home under the most mysterious of circumstances. A woman of considerable wealth and social standing, Miss Hargrave had been seen at a lavish party the previous evening. Yet when her maid arrived the next morning, the bedroom door had been locked from the inside, and Miss Hargrave was gone. The only sign of her presence was a single set of footprints leading from the bed to the window, where the curtains fluttered in the wind. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple case of a woman fleeing from an unwanted situation. But Poirot, with his unerring eye for detail, had immediately seen the discrepancies. "Mon ami, I must admit, there is something about this case that troubles me," Poirot murmured, his voice soft but firm. "There is no reason for Miss Hargrave to have fled in such a manner. The window, it is too small for a person of her size. The steps outside, they lead to nothing but a brick wall. And yet, those prints, they tell a different story, a very peculiar story indeed." As Poirot mused over the case, Captain Hastings, his loyal companion, sat across from him, taking notes in his ever-present notebook. He had been with Poirot for years, but there were still times when his friend's mind seemed to work in ways that left him baffled. "So, you believe it's not as simple as it looks?" Hastings asked, his brow furrowed. "That someone may be covering their tracks?" "Precisely, Hastings. Someone is most definitely covering something," Poirot replied, tapping the side of his head with one finger. "And it is in the very attempt to cover it up that the truth lies." Hastings nodded, still not quite understanding, but trusting in Poirot's genius. The Belgian detective had a way of making the most complex of cases seem simple, and he had earned a reputation that spread far and wide. "I have already spoken to the maid, the butler, and the family doctor," Poirot continued. "Each one has a story to tell, but each story leaves more questions than answers. The butler claims Miss Hargrave was in perfect health when she retired to her room. The maid reports nothing unusual during the night, and the doctor insists that Miss Hargrave had no reason to flee. But that is where their accounts fall short, mon ami." Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing as he thought back to the events surrounding Miss Hargrave's disappearance. Something in the details seemed off, and yet it was just out of reach, like a fleeting memory that danced on the edge of recall. "There is something missing," Poirot murmured, more to himself than to Hastings. "The steps, the missing footsteps, and then the window. It tells me a tale, one of manipulation, one of deception." Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" Poirot looked up, his sharp eyes gleaming with clarity. "What bothers me most is the lack of evidence of any sort of struggle. The window was closed, yet Miss Hargrave could not have climbed out, as the footprints suggest. No, Hastings, I believe the footprints were placed there deliberately." "Peut-être." "There?" Hastings echoed. "But why?" Poirot's lips curled into a slight smile, the hint of something profound lurking behind his words. "Because, mon ami, someone wanted us to believe in one story, when the truth is far darker. There is no such thing as a perfect crime. And this crime, this mystery, is far more elaborate than we've been led to believe." The next day, Poirot and Hastings returned to Miss Hargrave's home. It was an imposing mansion, with ivy creeping up the sides and a large ornate iron gate protecting the property from the outside world. A few curious neighbours had gathered outside, but the air of secrecy that surrounded the house kept them at a respectful distance. As Poirot and Hastings made their way up the grand staircase, the front door, the butler, Mr. Colton, opened it with a solemn expression. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he greeted, his voice low. "I trust you have come to resolve this dreadful situation." "We have, Mr. Colton," Poirot replied, his voice calm and precise. "We have come to observe, no more, no less. And if the truth is to be revealed, we shall uncover it in time." The butler nodded grimly and led them inside. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves outside and the faint hum of distant voices. Poirot took careful note of every detail: the faded tapestries on the walls, the neatly arranged furniture, the absence of personal touches that would have suggested a woman of vibrant life. It felt cold, as though Miss Hargrave's presence had left the house the moment she vanished. They were led to the sitting-room, where Miss Hargrave had last been seen. Poirot's eyes scanned the space with his usual meticulous care. The furniture was arranged exactly as it had been during the party the night before. Nothing seemed out of place, but Poirot's trained gaze immediately landed on a small detail that had gone unnoticed by the others: a single piece of paper on the ground near the window. He knelt down, picking it up carefully. It was a torn scrap of stationery, the kind one would expect from a private letter. There were no marks or handwriting on it, but Poirot's keen eyes saw something else. He noticed a faint impression on the paper, something that looked like a faint fingerprint. But it was barely there, almost imperceptible. "This, Hastings," Poirot said, holding up the scrap for his companion to see, "is the missing clue, the fingerprint. It is barely visible, but it is there. Someone was in this room, someone who wishes to remain hidden. The rest of the evidence has been carefully manipulated, but this small detail tells me that we are dealing with a criminal who is playing a game with us." Hastings leaned in, squinting at the paper. "But who would have left this behind, and why?" Poirot smiled thinly, his mind already at work. "Ah, Hastings, that is precisely the question. Someone has gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, but they overlooked this simple detail, this fingerprint. It is, as always, the smallest things that give the game away." As they continued their investigation, Poirot's sharp deductions began to weave a more intricate web. The maid had been acting strangely, almost as if she knew more than she was letting on. The family doctor, too, had been oddly evasive when questioned about Miss Hargrave's health. And yet, none of these individuals had offered any conclusive answers. By the time evening fell, Poirot had assembled his thoughts. He turned to Hastings, his face set in determination. "The answer, mon ami, is almost within our grasp. The fingerprint, the footsteps, the missing woman, all of it leads to a single conclusion. We are not dealing with a simple disappearance. We are dealing with a carefully planned deception. And someone close to Miss Hargrave, is behind it." As the night deepened, Poirot's suspicions grew clearer. The game was far from over. It had only just begun. Chapter 15. The Web of Deceit. The crisp chill of evening had set in by the time Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings returned to the scene of Miss Hargrave's disappearance. The mansion still stood in its quiet grandeur, as if it had swallowed up all signs of life and mystery in its walls. Yet Poirot's keen mind had not rested since their last visit. Every conversation, every gesture, every clue from their investigation was like a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each detail examined and re-examined. The small fingerprint on the torn scrap of paper had been the only breakthrough of significance. It was such a faint mark that even Poirot's sharp eyes had almost missed it. Still, his instinct had not failed him. He could not allow something so subtle to escape his notice. "There is more to this case than meets the eye, mon ami," Poirot said, as he and Hastings stood in the drawing-room of Miss Hargrave's home, examining the surroundings once again. "What is it, Hastings? What have we overlooked?" Hastings looked at his friend, his mind still trying to wrap around the twists and turns of the investigation. "Poirot, I must admit, I am at a loss. The more we search, the more I feel we are missing something critical. The fingerprint, it's too small, too faint to tell us much. But you're sure it's important?" Poirot nodded, his moustache twitching, with the faintest sign of approval. "Absolutely, Hastings. You see, the fingerprint is not just a clue in itself. It is a message, a sign that we are dealing with someone clever, someone who knows exactly how to cover their tracks. But the very fact that they left behind such a faint mark is telling." "But why leave a fingerprint?" Hastings asked, growing more confused. "If someone wanted to cover up a crime, Sue, surely they would be more careful." Poirot's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. "Exactly, Hastings. It is the act of leaving behind something so faint that makes it all the more intriguing. It is almost as if the person wanted us to find it, and yet they made sure it was barely perceptible. They wanted to give us just enough to keep us interested, but not enough to solve the mystery immediately. It is a game, one that they are playing with us." Hastings looked at Poirot, his admiration for the detective growing. "So, you think this is a deliberate attempt to mislead us?" Poirot smiled, his hands folding in front of him in his signature thoughtful pose. "Precisely. But what is the message they are trying to convey? That is what we must uncover." The next morning, Poirot and Hastings set out to follow up on the faint fingerprint clue. Poirot was certain that someone had deliberately placed it there, but the question remained: who and why? As they left Miss Hargrave's mansion, Poirot's thoughts turned to the people he had met during his investigation: the butler, the maid, the doctor, and of course Miss Hargrave's closest acquaintances. They were all suspects in one way or another, and it was only a matter of time before one of them slipped up and revealed their hand. Their first stop was to speak again with Mr. Colton, the butler. He was polite, but there was a noticeable coldness in his manner. Poirot had noticed that Mr. Colton was quick to point the finger at others, especially the maid, but had offered little information about himself. "Mr. Colton," Poirot began, "I must ask you, did you notice anything unusual the night Miss Hargrave disappeared?" Colton's lips tightened, and he adjusted his collar nervously. "Nothing out of the ordinary, sir. The house was quiet, as usual." Poirot's piercing gaze never wavered as he studied the butler. "Are you sure? The slightest detail might be important, even something you would consider insignificant." Mr. Colton hesitated before speaking again. "Well, now that you mention it, there was something strange about the way the window was left open. It had been locked from the inside, but the window, it had not been opened before. It was as if someone had entered and then deliberately left it ajar." Poirot nodded slowly. "That is indeed curious. You say the window had been locked?" Colton looked uncomfortable. "Yes, it was locked from the inside, but the latch itself, it didn't seem right, as if someone had forced it open from the outside." Poirot turned to Hastings, his mind already whirring. "Aha! It is as I suspected, Hastings. The window, the locked door, and the missing woman. It all points to one thing. Someone staged this disappearance to look like an escape, but it was never meant to be one." The two men left Colton with his troubled thoughts and headed towards the other suspect in their investigation: the maid, Alice Moore. She was a young woman with a gentle demeanour, but something about her behaviour had struck Poirot as odd. She was too calm, too composed for someone who had witnessed a strange disappearance in her household. The maid greeted them at the door, her face pale but resolute. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, I am at your service. Is there something more I can assist you with? Miss Moore, Poirot began, his tone gentle but firm. I must ask you again. Did you hear anything unusual the night Miss Hargrave disappeared? Any sounds? Anything at all? Alice seemed to think for a moment before replying. No, nothing. It was all very quiet. I don't know what happened. Poirot's eyes narrowed. But you knew her well, did you not? Alice hesitated, her eyes shifting. I did, Monsieur Poirot. Miss Hargrave was kind to me, but... Poirot pressed. I don't know, Alice whispered, her voice trembling. There were strange things happening around her in the days leading up to her disappearance. She was afraid, Monsieur Poirot. I could tell. Afraid of what? Poirot asked, his voice softening. Afraid of someone, I think, Alice murmured. She mentioned a man who had been following her. She was terrified that he would harm her. Poirot's heart quickened. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. A man? Did she ever say who he was? Alice shook her head. No, she never said. But I know she was worried. She would often look out the window, as if she were expecting someone. She even asked me to check the locks twice in the night. She was very uneasy. Poirot leaned forward, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Did she leave any messages for you? Anything of significance? Alice shook her head. No, but she did ask me to check her room before I went to bed that night. She wanted to make sure everything was locked. Poirot's mind raced. Locked, yes. She was trying to protect herself from someone. And now she is gone. The detective stood up slowly, his face set in grim determination. This is not just a simple disappearance, Hastings. This is a crime carefully planned, a web of deceit spun by someone close to Miss Hargrave. Hastings was beginning to see the shape of things now. Poirot, you mean someone inside the house did this? Poirot nodded. Indeed, but who? Who among them would go to such lengths to cover their tracks? That is the question. The investigation continued, each step forward revealing new twists and turns, but the final answer seemed ever elusive. Poirot knew that he had to keep his wits sharp, as every person they spoke to seemed to harbour secrets, and the web of deceit was growing thicker by the moment. The sun was setting as Poirot and Hastings left the maids' quarters. The night air was cool, and the mystery they were entangled in was as dark as the shadows that stretched across the cobblestone streets. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but only one thing was certain. The game was far from over. Chapter 16. The Shadow of the Past. The morning light crept in through the lace curtains, casting faint patterns on the polished floor of Hercule Poirot's hotel room. He sat at the window, looking out at the bustling streets below, but his mind was far away, immersed in the mystery that had become his obsession. Miss Hargrave's disappearance had taken on an increasingly sinister hue, and Poirot was more certain than ever that someone within the house was responsible for orchestrating the whole affair. Captain Hastings sat across from him, reading the latest report from the constable, but even he could sense the tension in the air. Poirot had not spoken much since their last interview with Alice Moore, the maid. There was an air of finality to the girl's words, of something unsaid but understood. Finally, Poirot stood, his sharp features set in determination. The time has come, Hastings. We have reached the threshold of the truth. but the door has not yet opened. The key is near, perhaps in the shadows of the past. Hastings, ever the faithful companion, followed his friend with a questioning look. The past? What do you mean, Poirot? Poirot's eyes glimmered as he turned towards the captain. Every mystery has a beginning, Hastings. Sometimes the most significant clue lies not in what is said, but in what is forgotten. We are not dealing with a simple case of disappearance. This is a story that began long before Miss Hargrave vanished. It is a story of secrets, old grievances, and unspoken fears. The detective's words echoed in Hastings' mind as they made their way back to the mansion. The air was thick with anticipation, and the silence between the two men spoke volumes. Neither of them knew exactly where the next clue would lead, but Poirot's instinct told him that the truth was within reach. Upon arrival, Poirot walked through the grand hall of the mansion with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was headed. Hastings followed closely, trying to piece together his friend's cryptic words. The detective paused at the foot of the staircase, his gaze fixed on something beyond the ornate banister. "This is it, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "The house holds its secrets within these walls. But what do we know of Miss Hargrave's life before her arrival here? It is time to speak to someone who may know more." With that, Poirot motioned for the two men to ascend the stairs. Reaching the top of the landing, they found themselves outside a small, tucked-away door, the paint chipped and faded with age. This was Miss Hargrave's personal study, where she spent much of her time in solitude. Poirot knocked lightly, and the door creaked open to reveal a darkened room, save for the soft glow of the afternoon sun that filtered through a stained-glass window. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a few chairs and a desk cluttered with papers and books. A voice emerged from the shadows, low and hesitant. "You are here." Poirot stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. The figure that emerged from the shadows was a woman, tall and thin, with dark eyes that reflected a history of pain. She was dressed in mourning clothes, her face pale and drawn. There was something about her that immediately struck Poirot as familiar, though he could not place it. "Madame, I presume," Poirot said, his tone polite yet insistent. The woman nodded slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her shawl. "I am Mrs. Blanchard, Miss Hargrave's aunt. You must be Monsieur Poirot. I have heard of your reputation." "Indeed, madame," Poirot replied. "I am investigating the disappearance of your niece. I trust you can provide some insight into her life before she came to live here." Mrs. Blanchard's eyes clouded with emotion. "Miss Hargrave, she was my sister's daughter. I raised her after my sister's death. I know all there is to know about her, every detail, every moment, but I do not understand what happened to her. I do not understand why she would disappear." Poirot took a step closer, his voice calm and measured. "Madame, if you wish to help me, I must ask you to trust me. You see, there is a shadow in her past, something that may have driven her to make decisions we do not understand. Tell me, what was she like before she arrived here?" Mrs. Blanchard closed her eyes, as if recalling a memory that pained her. "She was always a solitary child, quiet, but she had a fire within her, an ambition that none of us could tame. Her father was a wealthy businessman, and she had every luxury at her disposal. But there was something dark in her soul, something that I could never understand. She never spoke much of her past, but I know she had a relationship with a man, someone who, I believe, may have been connected to her decision to come here. Poirot's interest was piqued. "A man, madame. Do you know his name?" Mrs. Blanchard hesitated, her fingers twisting the fabric of her shawl. "I know only his first name, Victor, but he was not a man of honour. He was a shadow in her life, a presence that seemed to haunt her. She was afraid of him, Monsieur Poirot, terrified even. I begged her to leave him, but she refused." The detective's mind raced. "Victor, you say. Did she ever tell you what he wanted from her? Why she felt so threatened by him?" Mrs. Blanchard shook her head. "No, she kept it all inside. But she was never the same after she met him. She became withdrawn, secretive. She lost her spark, as if something had been taken from her. I feared she was being blackmailed, but I could never prove it." Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed. "This man, Victor, he may hold the key to this entire mystery. We must find him, madam, and we must find him quickly." Mrs. Blanchard's gaze flickered with a fleeting sense of hope, but it was quickly replaced by a shadow of dread. "I do not know where he is, Monsieur Poirot, but I do know one thing. He is the one who drove her to this point. I am certain of it." Poirot turned on his heel, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Then we must discover more about him, madam. Where did Miss Hargrave meet him? Do you know any of his friends, his associates?" Mrs. Blanchard's face softened, her eyes growing distant. "I do not know, but there was a man she mentioned once, someone who was connected to Victor. He went by the name of Edward Harper. I remember hearing her speak of him in passing. Perhaps he can lead us to Victor." Poirot's heart quickened. The name Edward Harper was not unfamiliar to him. It was a name that had come up in his research into the Hargrave family. A man of influence, well known in certain circles, but whose reputation had always been clouded by rumours. If he was tied to Victor, then he was a man of interest. "We shall follow this lead," Poirot said with certainty. "Thank you, madame. You have been most helpful." With that, he turned to leave the room, his mind already racing through the connections that had been revealed. The name, Edward Harper, would not be easily forgotten, nor would the mysterious figure of Victor. Together, they were the key to unlocking the truth behind Miss Hargrave's disappearance. As Poirot and Hastings left the mansion, the shadows of the past seemed to loom ever larger. The detective could feel the walls closing in on the culprit. He was close, so very close, to uncovering the truth. But the web of lies, deceit, and fear was not yet fully unravelled. There were still many more steps to take, many more secrets to uncover, before the final piece of the puzzle could be placed. The hunt for Victor and Edward Harper was on. Chapter 17. The Shadow of Edward Harper. The day had grown overcast as Poirot and Hastings set out for their next destination, the residence of Edward Harper. The name had lodged itself in Poirot's mind like a piece of gravel, impossible to ignore. Harper, it seemed, was at the heart of this tangled web of intrigue, and Poirot was determined to uncover the truth behind his connection to Victor, and ultimately Miss Hargrave. Edward Harper? Poirot muttered to himself as they walked toward the car. An enigma in his own right. But perhaps the key to this entire case lies with him. It is time to uncover his past, Hastings. We must see what secrets he has hidden. Hastings, always the more practical of the two, glanced at Poirot as they climbed into the vehicle. "And how exactly do you propose we do that, Poirot? I mean, this man could be anywhere. For all we know, he's long gone from this town." Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. "Ah, Hastings, you forget one thing. No one is ever truly gone. There are always traces, always clues, and where there are clues, there is a trail to follow." The detective's sharp eyes scanned the streets, his mind working tirelessly, piecing together the fragmented puzzle of the case. They arrived at Harper's residence, a grand house located on the outskirts of town, its gates tall and imposing, casting an air of secrecy around it. The house itself was a testament to wealth and power, but its windows were dark, almost as though it were a place long abandoned. Poirot stopped before the front gate, his gaze unwavering. "This is the place, Hastings. I can feel it in my bones." Hastings hesitated, sensing Poirot's intensity. "Well then, let's see if anyone's home. We don't have much time." The two men walked up to the front door, and Poirot rang the bell. They waited, the minutes stretching into what felt like an eternity. But there was no answer. Poirot, ever patient, turned to Hastings. "Sometimes, Hastings, it is the silence that speaks the loudest," he said, his voice low. "Let us take a look around the perimeter." The two of them circled the property, moving cautiously to avoid detection. As they reached the rear of the house, Poirot's sharp eyes caught sight of something that piqued his interest. A small, unkempt garden with a dilapidated fence that seemed to have once been well maintained. The overgrown hedges obstructed most of the view, but a narrow path led to a back door, partially ajar. "Ah, what have we here?" Poirot mused, approaching the door. Hastings looked at him warily. "Are we sure about this, Poirot? It doesn't feel right." Poirot waved him off. "Trust me, Hastings. When a door is left ajar, it is an invitation, not a warning." The two men slipped through the gap, careful not to make a sound. They found themselves in a small kitchen, the faint scent of stale bread lingering in the air. The room was largely empty, with only a few remnants of a once active household. The most intriguing detail, however, was a locked cabinet in the corner, its edges worn with age, as though it had been used frequently. Poirot's hand brushed over the surface of the cabinet. "The place where secrets are kept," he murmured, more to himself than to Hastings. "Let us see what it hides." He turned the knob, and the door creaked open, revealing a collection of papers, letters, receipts, and various documents. Dear. Topmost sheet caught Poirot's eye, and he picked it up carefully, reading the contents with a furrowed brow. It was a letter, dated only a few months prior, from a law firm in London. The letter was addressed to Edward Harper, and mentioned the settlement of a family estate. "Interesting," Poirot muttered. "It seems Mr. Harper has been busy with matters of inheritance. A family estate, perhaps one that Miss Hargrave may have had a claim to." Hastings leaned over his shoulder, his curiosity piqued. "Do you think this could be connected to her disappearance?" Poirot's eyes glittered with understanding. "Indeed, Hastings. I believe Miss Hargrave's disappearance is not just a simple case of kidnapping or a lover's quarrel. No, this is a matter of legacy and inheritance, something that could have turned deadly. They spent the next few hours thoroughly searching the house, uncovering more letters, some from businesses, others from various legal firms. But nothing concrete linked Edward Harper directly to Miss Hargrave. At least, not yet. The papers offered tantalizing glimpses of his life, his dealings, his associations, and his growing ties to certain influential families. But they did not provide the definitive answers they were searching for. Poirot's frustration was palpable as he sat down in an armchair in one of the study rooms. "It is not enough, Hastings. We are missing something crucial." Hastings sat across from him, trying to piece together the clues. Perhaps we should go back to the start. Miss Hargrave mentioned Victor. Maybe that's where we should focus next. Poirot's brow furrowed in concentration. But Victor is a ghost, Hastings. No one knows anything substantial about him. Edward Harper, however, is real. He exists in the tangible world. He leaves traces. We must find more about his connections, his history. Suddenly, Poirot's eyes widened. Wait! The law firm! They will have records on this estate. Who the beneficiaries are, and perhaps even how Miss Hargrave was involved. We must pay them a visit. The two men wasted no time. Poirot had an uncanny ability to move through the world of bureaucracy. With ease, and within hours, they found themselves at the law firm in London that had sent the letter to Edward Harper. After some polite but firm conversation with the receptionist, they were escorted to the office of a solicitor named Mr. Corbin. Mr. Corbin was a tall, well-dressed man in his mid-40s, with a carefully maintained air of authority. He welcomed them with a warm handshake, but was clearly perplexed by their sudden inquiry into his firm's dealings with Edward Harper. "I must admit, I am quite surprised by this inquiry," Mr. Corbin said as they sat down in his office. "Mr. Harper is a long-time client, and we've been handling matters related to his family estate for several months. What exactly can I help you with?" Poirot's voice was calm but insistent. "I am investigating a disappearance, Monsieur Corbin, a young woman named Miss Hargrave. She may have had some involvement with Mr. Harper, and we believe that there may be a connection to his family's estate. Can you provide any insight into this?" Mr. Corbin looked uneasy, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk. "I am afraid I cannot share specific details due to client confidentiality. However, I can tell you that Miss Hargrave was indeed mentioned in connection with Mr. Harper's estate. There was an arrangement made some time ago, one that would secure her financial future. But as for the details, I cannot be of much assistance." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "An arrangement? Financial security, you say? Was this a legal matter? A trust?" Corbin hesitated before responding. "Yes, that's correct. It was a trust fund. A rather large one, I believe. But Mr. Harper has always been a private man, and the details of his personal dealings are not something I can disclose without his permission." Poirot's mind raced. A trust fund. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. This was more than just a disappearance. It was a fight over money, inheritance, and power. "Thank you, Monsieur Corbin," Poirot said, standing up. "You have been most helpful." As they exited the law firm, Hastings looked at Poirot with a mix of awe and confusion. Poirot, what do you make of all this? A trust fund? Money? Is that what this is really about? Poirot's expression was pensive as he glanced up at the sky, where the clouds were beginning to part. I believe so, Hastings. But it is not just about money. It is about power, control, and the lengths people will go to protect what they believe is rightfully theirs. Edward Harper is hiding something, and I intend to find out what. Chapter 18. A Web of Secrets Unravelled. The fog had descended upon London that evening, thick and suffocating, as if the city itself was concealing some dark truth. Poirot and Hastings sat across from each other in the dimly lit drawing-room of the Langham Hotel, the silence broken only by the occasional clink of a teacup. Poirot's mind, however, was far from still. There is something more to Edward Harper than meets the eye, Poirot said, his fingers tapping rhythmically on his cup. I am certain of it. The trust fund, Miss Hargrave's connection to it, all of it. There is a deeper layer we have not yet uncovered. But it is within our grasp, Hastings. I can feel it. Hastings leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. But what do we know for sure? We know he was involved with her, possibly had a relationship with her, and there's this mysterious trust. But we still don't have enough concrete evidence to link him directly to her disappearance, do we? Poirot's eyes glinted as he placed his cup down carefully. Ah, Hastings, the pieces are beginning to fall into place, but we are still missing one crucial element. We must find out more about the nature of that trust fund. Who stands to benefit from Miss Hargrave's disappearance? We need to discover who else is involved. The detective stood up abruptly, a sense of urgency in his step. I shall visit the family estate again, Hastings. There is something there, a subtle clue, perhaps, that we have overlooked. Without another word, the two men made their way to the estate. The house, imposing as ever, stood before them like a silent sentinel, the darkened windows reflecting the last remnants of daylight. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings once more, noting the faint signs of neglect around the edges of the property. The well-manicured garden was now overgrown, and the grounds were eerily still. It seemed that Edward Harper had not spent much time at his country residence recently, but Poirot could sense that they were getting closer to the truth. As they approached the front door, Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing. There is something here, Hastings. Something we have missed. Hastings looked confused but followed Poirot as he made his way towards the side of the house. There, hidden in the ivy-clad walls, was a small door that seemed almost entirely concealed from view. It was a door that appeared to lead nowhere. Poirot bent down to inspect it closely. This is no ordinary door, Hastings. This leads to a hidden passage, an entryway that is not meant to be seen. He carefully turned the doorknob, which creaked loudly in protest, and pushed the door open. It led to a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air was cool and stale, and a faint musty smell clung to the walls. "Shall we?" Poirot asked with a raised brow, his voice tinged with curiosity. Hastings hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his instincts telling him that this was the moment they had been waiting for. They descended the staircase cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. At the bottom of the stairs they found themselves in a dimly lit hallway. the walls lined with old portraits and faded tapestries. Poirot's hand instinctively went to the light switch, and the room suddenly came into sharper focus. It was a small windowless room, filled with with an air of finality. "I know, Hastings, but there is something I must still understand, something that troubles me. Harper is a man of wealth and power. He will not go down easily. If we confront him directly now, he may try to cover his tracks in a way we cannot anticipate." Hastings stopped in his tracks and turned toward Poirot. "But what else is there to understand? We've found the documents, the letters, the evidence of the plot. There's no question any more. He's guilty." Poirot's eyes met Hastings's with a quiet intensity. "Yes, Hastings, Harper is guilty, but we must not act impulsively. We must be strategic. There is a hidden truth we have not yet uncovered, one that could turn the tide in our favour." "What do you mean?" Hastings asked, his curiosity piqued. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "The woman, Hastings, the mysterious woman who had been seen leaving Harper's estate just days before Miss Hargrave's disappearance. She holds the key to understanding Harper's true motive. We must find her." Hastings was silent for a moment, processing the gravity of Poirot's words. "But how are we supposed to find her? All we have is a name, one we don't even know yet. How can we track down someone with so little information?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Hastings, you forget the power of observation. The answer has always been before us. Harper's connections, his associates, his social circles, they all leave a trail. And that trail is one we will follow." With a plan in mind, Poirot and Hastings set off the next morning. They began by revisiting the people connected to Harper, his friends, business partners, anyone who might have been in close contact with him in the days leading up to Miss Hargrave's disappearance. Poirot's sharp mind sifted through the endless list of potential suspects, eliminating the irrelevant and focusing on those who might hold the answers. After hours of discreet inquiries, Poirot received a promising lead. A name surfaced: Clarissa Fairchild. She was an artist known for her involvement in London's high society, and had been seen several times in the company of Edward Harper. More importantly, she was said to have been at Harper's estate on the day Miss Hargrave vanished. Poirot and Hastings wasted no time in visiting Clarissa Fairchild's residence. The address was a stately townhouse in one of London's most fashionable districts, its exterior adorned with ivy and a carefully manicured garden. The front door was opened by a maid, who led them inside to a sitting room filled with light, expensive furniture and the distinct scent of fresh paint. Clarissa Fairchild was seated near the window, her gaze fixed on a canvas before her. She was a woman of striking beauty, with dark, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet confidence that spoke of a life lived among the city's elite. But there was something about her that unsettled Hastings, a quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from her very being. Poirot wasted no time in getting to the point. "Madame Fairchild, I trust you are aware of the unfortunate events surrounding Miss Hargrave's disappearance." Clarissa's expression didn't change, but her eyes briefly flickered with something, fear perhaps, or guilt. She set her paintbrush down slowly and faced the two men. "I am aware of the rumours," she said, her voice calm but tinged with an undertone of defensiveness. What is it that you want from me?" Poirot took a seat across from her, his gaze unwavering. "We are investigating the disappearance of Miss Hargrave. We believe that you may have information that could be helpful to our case. Specifically, we believe you were in the company of Edward Harper in the days leading up to her disappearance." Clarissa's lips tightened, but she didn't break eye contact. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I barely knew Miss Hargrave, and I've had no contact with Edward Harper for weeks. I was in the country, attending to my work." Poirot's expression softened, but only slightly. "Madame Fairchild, I do not believe you. You are an artist, a woman who values truth and beauty above all else. You know that hiding the truth will not help you. Please, I ask you, tell me what you know about Harper and Miss Hargrave." Clarissa was silent for a moment, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with the edge of her paintbrush. Finally, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, as if weighing the consequences of what she was about to say. "I didn't want to be involved," she said quietly. "But Edward Harper, he has a way of getting people to do things they don't want to. Yes, I was at his estate a few days before Miss Hargrave disappeared, but I didn't know what he was planning. He told me that Miss Hargrave had decided to leave, that she was running away from her life. He said it would be better if no one knew where she had gone." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And did you believe him?" Clarissa shook her head, her expression clouded with doubt. "I don't. Shelves and old books." But at the far end of the room was something far more interesting. An iron-bound chest, heavily secured with a complex lock. "This is it," Poirot said, his voice almost reverent. "The truth is inside that chest." Hastings looked on in wonder. "Do you think this is where Edward Harper has been keeping his secrets?" Poirot nodded. "It is highly likely. The chest holds something important. Documents, perhaps, or something far more revealing. We must open it." With great care, Poirot inspected the lock. His fingers worked deftly, a testament to his years of experience with puzzles and mysteries. After a moment, there was a faint click, and the lock sprang open. The chest creaked as Poirot lifted the lid. Inside, there were a series of papers and letters, carefully arranged in order. Poirot's eyes lit up as he rifled through them, pulling out the first letter he could find. It was dated just a few weeks ago. "Ah, here it is," Poirot muttered. "A letter from a solicitor. It appears that Edward Harper was in the process of rewriting his will. And here, a document with Miss Hargrave's name." He passed the letter to Hastings, who read it carefully. "It looks like Harper was planning to leave everything to her. But there's something strange about the wording of this document. It says that the inheritance would be revoked if she were to disappear or die under suspicious circumstances." Poirot's lips tightened. "A fail-safe clause, Hastings. One that would allow Harper to keep control over the estate if Miss Hargrave were to vanish." The implications were chilling. This wasn't just a case of a missing woman. It was a calculated move orchestrated by Edward Harper to ensure that he retained full control over the family fortune. Miss Hargrave's disappearance was no accident. It had been planned. But why? Poirot continued to sift through the chest, and his hand froze when he found another letter. This one sealed with a red wax crest. It was addressed to a man named Charles Hargrove, someone who had been mentioned briefly in the earlier documents. Poirot's mind whirred as he opened the letter and began to read. "It appears," Poirot murmured, "that Charles Hargrove was working closely with Edward Harper to ensure that Miss Hargrave's disappearance would go unnoticed. They planned to stage it as a voluntary departure, making it look like she had run away." Hastings looked at him, astonished. "You mean Harper and this Hargrove fellow were in on it together?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed. They believed they could pull off a perfect crime, but they underestimated one thing: me." With renewed determination, Poirot placed the letter back into the chest and began inspecting the remaining papers. There was one more document, a set of records from a private investigator hired by Edward Harper to follow Miss Hargrave's movements. "This," Poirot said, holding up the paper, "is the key to understanding why Miss Hargrave was targeted. She had discovered something that threatened to unravel Edward Harper's plans." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he scanned the final page of the records. There, scrawled in a faint ink, was a reference to a meeting between Miss Hargrave and a mysterious woman. A woman who had been seen leaving Harper's estate just days before her disappearance. "Who is this woman?" Poirot muttered to himself. And what was Miss Hargrave about to reveal? Hastings leaned in closer. His curiosity piqued. "What's it say, Poirot?" Poirot placed the document down, his face grim. It seems that Miss Hargrave had discovered the true motive behind her own disappearance. She had been blackmailing Edward Harper. She had learned that Harper was not the legitimate heir to the estate. He was an impostor, a man who had taken on a false identity to claim what was rightfully hers. Hastings stared at Poirot in disbelief. "You mean Harper isn't who he says he is?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Exactly, Hastings. Edward Harper was never meant to inherit the estate. Miss Hargrave was the rightful heir, and she had uncovered the truth. That is why they planned her disappearance. But we are going to make sure their plans come to an end." Chapter 19. The Confrontation. The air outside had grown colder as night fell over London, the fog now thicker than ever. It clung to the cobbled streets like a veil, creating an eerie silence that seemed to stretch endlessly across the city. Inside the Langham Hotel, Poirot sat by the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames as his mind churned with the weight of their discoveries. Hastings, ever the more restless of the two, paced in front of the fireplace. "Poirot, we're so close. We have all the pieces. It's just a matter of confronting Harper and exposing him." Poirot didn't respond immediately. He had been unusually quiet since their visit to Harper's estate, and Hastings couldn't help but notice the slight furrow of concern etched into his friend's brow. Finally, Poirot spoke, his voice calm but tinged. "Now, Edward is a master of manipulation. He made me feel as if I was doing the right thing, that Miss Hargrave was simply taking some time for herself. But then I found out about the trust. I realized that Edward was lying. Lying? About what?" Hastings asked, leaning forward. Clarissa looked at them both, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Edward Harper was planning to take control of everything. The trust fund, the estate. It was all part of his scheme to claim everything for himself. He had no intention of letting Miss Hargrave inherit it, and when she found out, he had to make sure she was out of the way. Hastings was stunned. "You mean Harper was behind her disappearance?" Clarissa nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, but I didn't know how far he would go. I never imagined he would go to such extremes." Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. "You've done well, Madame Fairchild. You have been most helpful." Clarissa looked down, her face filled with regret. "I wish I hadn't gotten involved. I should have known better." Poirot stood and smiled reassuringly. "There is still time for redemption, madame. If you help us bring Harper to justice, you will have done what is right." As they left the townhouse, Poirot turned to Hastings with a look of quiet satisfaction. "We are closer than ever now, Hastings. Harper will not escape justice. He will have to face the consequences of his actions." The two men walked back into the mist-covered streets, their determination unwavering. The truth was within their grasp, and there was no turning back now.